Page 10. Many of which occupy an intermediate sphere between private enterprise and governmental agency. In that context, the public space will not exclude all religions as private. It will contain, by negotiated consent, some of the symbols of the plural religious groups, for example, the plural religious benedictions at the presidential inauguration. From the perspective of the first model, the rhetoric of the religious right would seem to be a breach in the wall of separation between religion and the state. From the perspective of a pluralist model or of historical practice, it appears more as an argument for drawing the line, in accordance with the pattern of the 1950s rather than the 1970s. There is clearly much room for continuing discussion between the Jewish community and the Christian fundamentalist religious groups on the pros and cons of these alternative approaches that are both based in American history. The much publicized statements of some evangelical leaders in favor of a Christian America is an obvious item for such discussion. In one sense, this aspiration implies an anti-pluralist position. In context, it can be interpreted as expressing a concern about pagan America, where the correlative of Christian is not other religious groups and perhaps not even secular humanists as much as the hedonistic lifestyle revolution of the 1960s. The proliferation of softcore pornography, the acceptance of soft drug use, changes in the guidelines on public expression of obscenity, and the conventionalization of alternative sexual morality are ubiquitous facts of the last 2 decades. It would have been surprising indeed if there had been no reaction to these changes from the religious community, whether Jewish or Christian. Any ongoing forum with the religious right would suggest potential alliance partners in the Jewish community on specified issues. There have already been common approaches adopted by the Jewish religious Orthodox groups and the more traditional Christian ministries. A parallel illustration is the combined suit of the Catholic Archdiocese, the Salvation Army, and Agudat Israel regarding the acceptability of homosexuality among religious workers in New York City. A more piquant illustration is the commonality of interest between the moral majority view on pornography and the more militant direct action campaign against pornography of radical feminist groups. The most significant common ground between the religious right and the Jewish community is support for Israel. The crucial aspect of this shared policy is that the mainstream Christian denominations, through their bureaucracy in the National Council of Churches, have consistently adopted ideological positions, advocating the aims of the PLO, among other revolutionary Third World movements. These positions fall within the left-wing spectrum of the Democratic Party and are similar to those held by Jesse Jackson and his faction. It is sometimes objected that fundamentalist support for Israel is derived from a Christian apocalyptic vision of Jewish conversion, after the ingathering of the exiles in Israel as prelude to Christ's second coming. Page 11. Manasseh ben Israel, the noted rabbi of Amsterdam, petitioned Oliver Cromwell successfully in 1654 for the right of Jews to enter England. His argument included the claim that Christ's second coming could not take place, in the Christian view, until the Jews were returned from their dispersion among all the nations of the earth. England's bar to Jewish immigrants must then be lifted on pain of blocking the eschatological proceedings. There is no record of protest by Jewish immigrants or refugees to England of this appeal to Christian beliefs. In any event, several steps in the process of building bridges between the Jewish community and the evangelical community have already taken place. The Zionist and Jewish Orthodox constituencies have been actively involved in these. There is little doubt that further steps in this process will alleviate some of the tensions generated during the recent election campaign, and may also reorient Jewish perceptions with an impact on future political behavior. Image projection and policy. A third factor that prevented the realignment of the Jewish electorate was the signal projected to the Jewish community by the selection of the Mondale-Ferraro ticket. Walter Mondale symbolized, in origins and style, the centrist Humphrey tradition of the Democratic Party. Geraldine Ferraro, despite the novelty of a woman candidate for vice president, represented the tradition of ticket balancing, with a more conservative Italian member of the urban ethnic spectrum. Of course, the Ferraro nomination can be perceived as ticket balancing only in a parochial regional framework. From the perspective of national politics or even National Democratic Party politics, her selection heightened the ideological imbalance. It confirmed once more the triumph of McGovern-like foreign policy views, with the sole exception of the stand on Israel, at the top of the Democratic Party ticket. In the context of competing image projection, the Republican administration had transmitted signals that were disturbing to the Jewish electorate. So, even though the record of the administration on balance compared favorably with predecessor Democratic administrations, there was a basis for a lack of enthusiasm. Several items could be cataloged here, ranging from the rhetoric on the AWACS sale to Saudi Arabia, near the beginning of Reagan's presidency, to the Hague resignation during the Lebanon War, or even the appearance of insensitivity of the prayer breakfast at the Republican convention. Yet, this review of the record has not weakened the central thesis of the politics of nostalgia approach. That thesis is that there has been a growing divergence between the policies of the Democratic Party and the real and long-term public interest of the American Jewish community. The corollary of that thesis is that this divergence was masked in the past election campaign by a refusal to recognize the new realities of the Black-Jewish relationship, by a misinterpretation of the potential areas of agreement between Christian evangelicals and the Jewish community, as well as by the residual symbols and ties deriving from a long history of Jewish participation in the Democratic Party. Page 12. If the thesis is correct, then the reality principle will lead to the delayed realignment in the near future. 2. The Jewish community and the new class. The preceding account of the way in which the Jewish community has avoided facing up to the need to move toward a more realistic political expression of its interests can find a degree of confirmation in the social attitudes and political behavior of many grassroots constituencies within that community, particularly among the more intensely pro-Israel, more ethnic, and more orthodox religious sectors. This account faces a significant challenge, however, in light of the empirical observation of the attitudes of leadership groups and of many broadly based membership organizations throughout the Jewish community. Jewish Democratic voters hardly fit representation as a retrospective group locked in nostalgia for a traditional Democratic Party. They articulate an assertive self-consciousness in their support of the substantive positions, not only the slogans and symbolism of the Mondale-Ferraro campaign. This is true precisely of those positions that endorse the major elements of the McGovernite vision of the world. The security needs of Israel are accepted from a general view which does not perceive a threat of Soviet aggression or of subversion independent of American military excess or the indigenous revolutionary forces of the underdeveloped nations of the Third World. The simple version, then, is that many Jews voted for the party which Ambassador Kirkpatrick correctly identified as the San Francisco Democrats, because they believe in the views of that party. Had the Jewish community been searching for ways to abandon an outmoded historic loyalty, the unexpected unfolding of the Ferraro and Jackson episodes provided an extraordinarily opportune occasion. It required a very strong exercise of denial for the large Jewish community in New York to avoid realizing the details of transactions of the real estate firm, of which Mrs. Ferraro was an officer and major owner. A large portion of the funds that were borrowed from the assets under conservatorship of an elderly New York widow, in a transaction that seems to provide the neglected basis for an indictment under misdemeanor charges of commingling of funds and self-dealing, were used as a deposit on apartment buildings in a neighborhood largely having as tenants elderly Jewish residents. The political route to the conservatorship between the Congresswoman's office and the Queen's Courthouse, that went virtually unnoticed in the mass media isolation of Ferraro from her husband's affairs, was a commonplace in local New York City neighborhood political awareness. Similarly, a decision was required during the campaign on which of two competing stimuli Jesse Jackson or the moral majority would receive a reflexive reaction. The decision of the majority was to overreact to the alleged threat to religious pluralism, while charging others with fostering overreaction to Jesse Jackson's Libyan connection. Page 13. Farrakhan's antisemitism or Walter Mondale's hesitation in the condemnation of antisemitism and of Jesse Jackson's actions. The selectivity exercised by the Jewish community in its perception of Geraldine Ferraro and of the Jackson campaign testify to the depth and strength of its underlying pro-democratic party attitudes. The uniqueness of the Jewish electorate among the relevant peer groups of other white urban ethnics or suburban affluent voters proves the point. In this view, the Jewish vote is to be compared with other constituencies that voted in disproportionate numbers for Senator McGovern in 1972 and for Walter Mondale in 1984. Prominent among these are the faculties of the elitist university and the journalists and editors of the prestige media. Not only statistical correlation but direct observations indicate that the majority of the Jewish electorate share the views and identifies with the attitudes of these groups that constitute the so-called new class in American political society. The self-image of the Jewish community as a vanguard moral group is reinforced by its identification with these trend-setting elites. In my view, the reasons for this identification are traceable to the patterns of the Jewish community's transition to modernity, but the development of that argument is not germane to the present discussion. It is relevant to note that the new class is an ethnically transcending group, just as liberal attitudes within the Jewish community correlate with transcendence of ethnicity and departure from traditionalist orthodoxy. Jewish support for the Mondale Ferraro candidacy is consistent with its identification with the views of the new class and not with the lagging survival of its involvement with the Coalition Democratic Party. This support, in fact, marks a distinction between the Jewish community and other Democratic Party loyalists, such as the Southern Democratic Party member and the Midwest farmer or trade unionist, who vote Democratic without sharing or identifying with new class attitudes or perceptions. There may be some shifts in Jewish voting behavior toward the Republican Party. These could come from the demographic strengthening of the Orthodox group within the Jewish community. The more intensely committed pro-Israel or pro-Soviet Jewry constituencies, including Israeli and Soviet immigrants, may seek a greater degree of coherence in Jewish communal policies. Conceivably, though not necessarily, the Republican administration will develop policies that are not only compatible with, but supportive of these views, on the common ground of a strong defense against the threat of Soviet aggression in the Middle East and elsewhere. Further, the historically small base of communication between the Republican Party and the Jewish community lends itself readily to expansion in the ordinary course of the public relations activities of an administration in power. The recent formation of a Jewish Republican national organization virtually guarantees some measure of political realignment. Page 14. In this view, however, the majority of the Jewish community is not prepared to reverse its political partisanship on the basis of a perceived divergence of interest with a McGovernized Democratic Party. That majority apparently views its interests in terms of its moral image in the context of a liberal ideology that is attuned to the adversary culture of the new class. The condition of that commitment is that the Democratic Party repudiate anti-Israel positions that derive from its general left foreign policy orientation, and that it lend moral support to the cause of the Soviet Jewish community. In this view, then, a realignment of the Jewish community's political position would only follow upon changes in the relationship between the new class and the administration. In a recent issue of Encounter, Paul Johnson argued that the Reagan presidency had regained from the media the power of setting the political agenda. In Johnson's earlier account, in his book Modern Times, the media had been able to assert this power through its effective exploitation of the complex construct of Watergate as the basis for its successful media putsch against the presidency. There is evidence in support of Johnson's view of the restored ability of the administration to fix the vocabulary of political debate, but only after the event. The success of the government's economic policies during its first term has brought to an end the use of Reaganomics as a synonym for voodoo economics. The intense Soviet response to the promise of a strategic defense initiative may soon lead to the withdrawal of derisory label of Star Wars. Yet, where political success is necessarily long drawn out, from the defense build-up to Central American policy, the power to set the framework of the political debate remains contested. An examination of the discussion in major public forums of administration views on the Opportunity Society or of the nature of the American commitment as a responsible ally to small anti-Soviet nations would probably show that the adversary culture has retained its power to set the terms of the political debate as distinct from the ability to decide policy. The Reagan administration's ability to govern effectively in its second term will depend in many ways on its ability to regain the degree of control of the terms of the debate of the public agenda that is legitimate and normative in democratic society. It needs to be recalled that, in a democracy, the power to set the political agenda is vested in the government, because the government faces periodic elections. In contrast, the prestige adversary media that have sought to set the agenda through advocacy journalism and convergent selectivity of focus on particular issues have no significant competitive media opposition group and few mechanisms of accountability. The outcome of the continuing contest between the new class and the administration on determining the agenda of public debate will critically affect the future pattern of Jewish political behavior. The effect of that contest, however, goes far beyond the realignment issue. A successful resolution by the administration of its power, within the framework and appropriate limitations of American democracy. Page 15. To assert the executive authority's traditional role in setting up policy debates would lead to a far wider realignment. The Democratic Party would probably then be required to undergo a transformation into a true opposition party, that is, a party capable of governing the country and pursuing the national interest, rather than a series of ideological constituencies closely linked to the adversary counterculture, while retaining some of the voting groups of the historic Democratic Party. In such a restructuring of the Democratic Party, the position the Jewish community would take is not clear on the basis of the vote in 1984. Nathan Perlmutter, National Director, Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, estimates of the Jewish vote for the presidency range from a 70-30th gulf to a narrowing 60-40th split, with Mondale prevailing in both cases. More interestingly than curiously, politically liberal Jewish pulse-takers found the larger variance, while their politically conservative co-religionists found the closer margin. Neither set of figures, let alone the accommodating popular wisdom of a 2-to-1 Mondale margin, warrants either the liberals' feelings of vindication or the conservatives' embarrassment. To understand the significance of 1984's Jewish voting patterns requires an earlier base point, without which comparison is impossible and evaluation, a game of blind man's buff. Over the short term, using 1980 as the base for comparison, liberals are understandably gladdened and conservatives rightly disappointed. After all, only 4 years ago, for the first time in modern history, a Democratic candidate for the presidency failed to garner a majority of Jewish votes. Jimmy Carter secured but 44% of their votes, and to compound the indignity, Ronald Reagan from way out in right field, alien if not chilly country for Jews, won fully 39%. Given Reagan's high marks on Israel in the intervening 4 years, the very issue on which Carter lost credibility among Jews, how not, if one is a political liberal, feel gratified by Republican slippage and Democratic recoupments among Jewish voters? After all, Jews, it would seem, in 1984 confounded the pundits and came home. Or did they? If we take as our base point the 1960s, their graph's voting line tracks a wider perspective, and the 1980 to 1984 section reads more like a pause than a turnaround. In 1960, Kennedy received 82% of the Jewish vote, Nixon 18%. In 1964, Johnson ran over Goldwater 90% to 10% among Jews. In 1968, 83% of the Jewish vote was Humphrey's, 16% Nixon's. Page 16. The 1970s, however, ushered in a significant change in Jewish voting patterns with Richard Nixon, better than doubling his percentage of the Jewish vote, albeit more thanks to George McGovern and his politic of quotas domestically, and appeasement abroad than to Nixon himself. In 1976, Ford, Carter's debits not yet in evidence, nonetheless retained 28% of the Jewish vote. To be sure, Reagan's 1980 score of 39% among Jews fell off fractionally in 1984, but over the longer term, the plain arithmetic is that in a score of years, the percentage of Jews voting for a Republican candidate for the presidency has doubled. Still, what happened in 1984? Why, given the generally benign regard for Reagan in the Jewish community, did the tracking line of Jewish voting pause take a step back? In the spring of 1984, the American Jewish Committee commissioned a national survey of American Jews, in which 1,000 Jewish respondents were asked, among other questions, who they voted for in 1980, and then, knowing what you do now, whom would you rather have seen elected in 1980, Reagan or Carter? 44% answered that they had voted for Carter and 39% for Reagan. 15% had voted for Anderson. Interestingly, in response to the second question, while 47% would, retroactively, have preferred Carter's victory, 53%, a first-time Jewish majority, answered Reagan. And so, what indeed did happen in the months leading to November? Timing, religion in politics, and appreciation of an old, comfortable shoe happened all at once. Timing, had Jesse Jackson and the Democratic Party's opportunistic insouciance been an autumn rather than a summer story, and the separation of church and state summer rather than autumn headlines, that 53% figure would likely have been a more nearly realized omen. Surely, if presidential candidates, their long record and open book, can nonetheless make it or break it in one pre-election television debate, small wonder that Jesse Jackson's summer antics and Mondale's glazed view of them cooled in November's memory. Among Jews, that was Mondale's gain, Reagan's loss. Religion in politics. In the election stretch run, this issue, more than any other, troubled Jews. American Jews, so many of whose parents and grandparents fled religious persecution, have more in common with each other in their shared wariness of true believers than they do in their modes of religious observance. No matter that some who invoked Christian values in their political rhetoric intended it as a synonym for uncontroversial moral values, it was heard by many Jews as the language of separatism. Antisemitism for many centuries was propounded by religious zealots in the accents of Christian conceit. In 1984, a large number of Jews reacted trepistically. In their polling booths they fled. Again, Mondale's gain and Reagan's loss. Page 17. The old, comfortable shoe. Walter Mondale is the quintessential liberal. Jews traditionally have been liberal, or perhaps it's liberalism that has been their tradition, but whichever, Mondale's sermons on compassion, fairness, and peace sounded Jewish, and it sometimes being easier to misgivingly stay with one's own than to abruptly break away, Jews remained in the range of their 1980 vote. It was an inertia facilitated by the mischievous quota system, having been camouflaged by the Democrats as verifiable measurements, by Israel not being an issue, and because the Democrats' willful failure to condemn antisemitism in San Francisco had been overshadowed by the Republicans' willful courting of Christians qua Christians in Dallas. And so on November 6, familiar Walter Mondale and the remembered Democratic Party of their youth seemed more congenial, safer than those Dallas Republicans, a still new neighborhood for many Jews. There is, of course, a vulnerability to positing the Jewish vote as if Jews were a monolithic entity. They aren't any more than other American groups, and in their parts Jews often reflect the American electorate. So it is that in the Southwest Reagan country, Texas Jews also favored Reagan over Mondale 64% to 36%. Borough Park in Brooklyn is home for thousands of Hasidim, ultra-Orthodox Jewish sects, and as did Christian fundamentalists, they too favored Reagan 61% to 34%. And Jews had their own gender gap. The Washington Post ABC News poll reported Mondale prevailing over Reagan among Jews 69% to 31%, but the survey also found that among Jewish males, Mondale lost 8 percentage points, with President Reagan gaining as many. What does all this Jewish voting esoterica mean for, and how important is it to 1988's presidential aspirants? Whoever they may be, the likelihood is that they will run a closer race than did Reagan and Mondale. In races in which the popular vote is close, electoral votes gain weight. Given the residential deployment of Jews in major states, and the earnestness with which they exercise their suffragism, their vote in 1988 is likely to have more leverage significance than in 1984. What the 1970s suggested and what the 1980s have confirmed is that Democrats may no longer take the Jewish vote for granted, and that Republicans need no longer write off the Jewish vote. And while Jews are butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, each individually responsive to his own mix of social, economic, and personal dispositions when exercising his franchise, broadly speaking, what will Jews as Jews be looking for in 1988? A Democratic Party which, in its commendable sensitivity to American pluralism, doesn't sacrifice individual rights on the voting altar of group preference, the other side of whose coin is reverse discrimination, and they will be looking for a Republican Party which, in its commendable sensitivity to moral majorities, does not seem inhospitable to no less moral minorities. Page 18. Nathan Glazer, Professor of Sociology and Education, Harvard University Graduate School of Education. There is one principal reason why it is worth discussing the Jewish role in the 1984 elections, because the expected continuation of the drift or shift to the Republican candidate didn't occur. Indeed, and to general surprise, fewer Jews voted for Reagan in 1984 than in 1980, according to exit polls. There has been some argument as to whether this is really true. Elliot Abrams has pointed out that exit polls are not conducted in areas of dense Jewish concentration, but in ethnically mixed areas where Jews are likely to be more prosperous, more assimilated, and, he argues, more liberal. The irony and paradox of this situation should not be unnoted. For decades, Jews have voted against their apparent economic interests. With fewer and fewer of them workers and more of them businessmen and professionals, concentrated in free professions such as law and medicine, one would expect Jews to vote Republican like other businessmen and professionals. It seemed to be only a matter of time before their economic interests would wear down the nostalgic heritage of the past, when Jews voted socialist, and then for liberal Democrats, and their voting would come into line with their economic interests. The 1984 election was to be the conclusion of that process. It wasn't, and the argument is now made that it was because poor Jews were not sufficiently sampled. So Jews remain exceptional. They are a group where you have to sample the poor to find the Republicans. I think, by the way, Abrams is right. I suspect that poorer Jews, more Orthodox Jews, Jews that live in Jewish neighborhoods, and are more fully committed to Jewish interests probably voted more for the Republicans than did upper-middle-class Jews. Neither were voting their class interests primarily, though Jews, like everyone else, are of course affected by their economic position when they vote. But Jewish voting has been exceptional in the degree to which economic interest is submerged by other interests. These other interests prevailed in 1984, as they have prevailed in other years, and they swung Jewish voters against Republicans. What are the non-economic interests of Jews? Crudely, they may be defined as cultural and/or ideological. It has long been argued by analysts of Jewish political behavior, particularly but not only Jewish analysts, that Jews are more altruistic, public-minded, civic-minded, and social-minded than other Americans. They are more supportive of civil rights, of civil liberties, and of American assistance to developing nations, though the latter may have changed in the last decade or so. The facts are hardly in dispute. Even when Jewish defense organizations were in the forefront of the fight against quotas in affirmative action, page 19, more Jews supported this key interest of blacks than other white Americans. Even when there was an uproar over Jesse Jackson's statements in support of the PLO and his alleged anti-Semitic remarks, more Jews supported him than did other whites. The interpretation of this anomaly, however, is disputable. Is it that Jews self-sacrificingly support positions they believe are right and best for all? Or do we find an underlying explanation, which is another kind of interest than simple economic interest, but an interest nevertheless? I incline toward the latter explanation. Jews, an often persecuted minority, have strong security interests which they express when voting. These security interests can for convenience be divided into two parts: the security of Israel abroad and protection against anti-Semitism at home. What was surprising about the 1984 election is that it was not the security of Israel, but, because of a number of perhaps purely adventitious developments, concern about the security of Jews in the United States, that became the marginally determining force in Jewish voting. Domestic anti-Semitism has not been a major force affecting Jewish voting in the United States, except for very occasional local elections, for decades. If the issue of anti-Semitism is raised in an election, it enters in the most roundabout way. Not by way of any expression of anti-Semitism by a candidate, nor by one candidate accusing another candidate of being anti-Semitic, even if he doesn't express it, which would be considered an outrageously improper tactic, but by one candidate accusing another candidate of not being sufficiently critical of someone else's alleged anti-Semitism. This is the way the issue initially entered the 1984 campaign. Would Jesse Jackson reject Farrakhan? And would other Democratic presidential candidates attack Jackson for not rejecting Farrakhan? That charge was raised by Vice President Bush in one speech against the Democratic Party. Even that was considered going very far indeed. It was expected that the compromises patched up at the Democratic Convention over the various issues Reverend Jackson had raised would antagonize Jews, and undoubtedly many were antagonized. But the security concerns over Jackson got transferred subsequently to the Republicans because of the militant fundamentalist Christian element in the Republican coalition. All parties are of course coalitions. The last open anti-Semites in American politics were some Southern Democrats of the party Jews supported in such overwhelming numbers in the 1930s and 1940s. Immigrants and Catholics and Jews lived together in a party under Roosevelt, one of whose major elements harbored ex-Ku Kluxers and other enemies of immigrants, Jews, Catholics, socialists, and blacks. That, in a two-party system, is not a contradiction. What happened in 1984 is that the passionate commitment of militant Christians to the Republicans, because of such issues as abortion and prayers in schools, began to worry many Jews. That worry took sharper form when the peculiar story about Armageddon broke, and President Reagan took such a mild and uncritical line in responding to a question about it.